Before you grab 2 mirrors and a cardboard tube, there's something you need to know. The men who built the first battlefield periscopes didn't have a workshop, a manual, or even proper mirrors. They had a beach, a pile of scrap wood, and the bodies of their friends behind them as motivation. And what they built in 3 days changed the outcome of a war. This video is going to show you exactly how World War I soldiers built periscopes from almost nothing. But before we get to the build, you need to understand the situation these men were in, because once you do, every single design decision they made will make complete sense. By the end of this, you're going to know 3 things that almost nobody talks about. Why the man who invented the military periscope rifle was a builder's foreman and not a soldier. Why the Germans ordered 10,000 periscopes from a camera company, and why that almost failed completely. And what happened to the periscope at the very end of Gallipoli that is one of the strangest stories in the history of any military invention. Let's start with the problem. Gallipoli, May 1915. The Allied and Ottoman trenches at a place called Quinn's Post are 50 meters apart. 50 meters. That's the length of a swimming pool, from one end to the other. At that distance, a trained sniper with a clear line of sight doesn't miss. And the Ottoman snipers at Gallipoli were not missing. Every time an Australian or New Zealand soldier raised his head above the parapet to fire, he had about half a second before a bullet arrived at roughly the same height as his skull. The casualty figures from head wounds in the first weeks of the campaign were staggering, and not because the soldiers were careless. It was because the geometry of the situation made survival and the ability to fight mutually exclusive. You could hide, or you could fight. You couldn't do both. So the question that every soldier in that trench was trying to answer was the same one. How do you shoot at someone you can't look at? The answer was about to come from a man whose entire career before the war had been spent building houses. Lance Corporal William Beach was not an optician, not an engineer, and not a scientist. He was a builder's foreman from Australia, a man who spent his working life measuring timber, cutting wood square, and fitting things together so they didn't fall apart. And in May 1915, those were exactly the right skills to have. According to Private John Adams, who served alongside Beach at Gallipoli, the idea didn't come from a moment of inspiration or a brilliant flash of lateral thinking. It came from watching his friends die. Beach had seen too many soldiers shot through the head while trying to do the most basic thing a soldier needs to do: aim at the enemy. He didn't sit down and formally design anything. He just started solving the problem with what he had. He took a standard Lee Enfield rifle, the main weapon of the Australian Imperial Force, and cut the stock in half. He rejoined the 2 halves with a wooden board, attached a mirror at the top, angled at 45 degrees, and another mirror at the bottom, also at 45 degrees. Then he tied a length of wire to the trigger. Now a soldier could crouch safely below the parapet. The top mirror looked over the sandbags. The bottom mirror showed him what the top mirror was seeing. He pulled the wire, and the rifle fired. The first version was rough. The mirrors weren't perfect, and the accuracy at anything beyond 50 meters was not great. But here's the thing about 50 meters. The Turkish trenches were 50 meters away. The effective range of the periscope rifle was about 100 meters. The target was already inside that range. It didn't need to be a precision instrument. It needed to be better than nothing, and it was significantly better than nothing. Within days, other soldiers in the unit had built their own versions. Within weeks, it had spread up and down the front line. And then something happened that makes this story genuinely strange. They built a factory on the beach. Let's be clear about what this actually looked like. Anzac Cove is a beach, a narrow strip of sand and gravel at the base of steep cliffs, under constant artillery fire, with Turkish positions on the high ground above it. This was not a safe place to build anything. It was barely a safe place to stand. And yet, by the end of May 1915, there was a functioning production line on that sand. Not a factory in any real sense. Wooden frames, wire, mirrors sourced from wherever mirrors could be found, scrap lumber from supply crates. The same basic principle as Beech's original design, replicated over and over by soldiers who had never studied optics in their lives. By the end of May, they had produced 300 observation periscopes.
Not just the rifle versions,
Simple observation periscopes that let men look over the parapet without presenting their heads as targets. 300. In a month. On a beach. Under fire. General William Birdwood, the commander of the Anzac forces, noticed. In 1916, he said publicly, "Our complete moral superiority over the Turk is partly due to a very clever invention of a man named Beech." Moral superiority is a military term for the ability to dominate the psychological space of a battle, to make the enemy feel outmatched. A builder from Australia with 2 mirrors and a piece of wire had given his side moral superiority. And what did the British War Office give William Beech in return? £100. In 1921. 6 years after the invention, long after the war had ended, long after Gallipoli had been evacuated, long after the periscope had spread to every front in the conflict. £100, which in today's money is roughly $4,000,
for an invention
that a field marshal described as critical to the outcome of a military campaign. Now let's talk about what the Germans did, because this is the part of the story that almost nobody knows. When the German military command saw what periscope rifles could do, they didn't improvise on a beach. They issued a procurement order. The Prussian War Ministry ordered 10,000 periscope rifle units, and they gave the contract to a German optical firm called Leitz. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Leitz is the company that became Leica, the manufacturer of some of the most famous cameras ever made. In 1915, they were primarily known for their optical precision: microscopes, measuring instruments, lenses. And the German military told them to make 10,000 periscope sighting systems. The design was more sophisticated than Beech's original. The periscope unit was detachable, clipping onto an ordinary service rifle rather than requiring the stock to be cut. The trigger was connected via cable rather than wire. In theory, it was cleaner, more professional, more reliable. And then they discovered the problem that nobody on the beach at Anzac Cove had thought about, because the beach at Anzac Cove is hot and dry. Mirrors fog. In the cold and wet conditions of the Western Front and the Eastern Front, bare mirror glass exposed to temperature changes on one side and warm air on the other would develop condensation on the reflective surface. The image would blur. The system would stop working. The early Leitz units failed because of this, and soldiers couldn't see through them. Leitz solved it by sealing the optics inside the housing, creating a closed system that prevented the temperature differential from reaching the mirror surface. This is a small engineering detail that appears in almost no popular account of World War I periscope history, but it matters because it represents the gap between a field improvisation and a manufactured product. Beech's beach-built periscopes worked at Gallipoli in 1915. They would have failed on the Somme in November. The environment wasn't the same, and the design hadn't accounted for that. Leitz had to engineer around it, and the solution they came up with sealed optical chambers, is a principle that shows up in camera lenses, binoculars, and scientific instruments to this day. The Bavarian War Ministry, meanwhile, ordered 2,500 units from a different company based in Nuremberg. They had the same mirror problem and solved it the same way: sealed optics. So, by mid-war, all major combatant armies were using periscope rifles. The British, the French, the Belgians, the Russians with a periscope version of the Mosin Nagant, and the Americans, when they entered the war, were already studying the designs. One soldier's improvisation, made from scrap wood and mirrors on a beach in Turkey, had become standard military equipment on every front in the world's largest war. And then came the strangest chapter of all.
December 1915.
Gallipoli. The Allied command has made a decision. They are leaving. 8 months of fighting, tens of thousands of casualties, and the strategic objective of knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war by taking the Dardanelles had failed. The order comes down: evacuate the peninsula. Now there's a problem that has nothing to do with fighting. How do you withdraw from a position where the enemy is 50 meters away without them noticing? If the Turks detected the evacuation, they would attack. The soldiers moving toward the boats would be in the open. The losses could be catastrophic. The solution came from another Australian, Lance Corporal William Scurry. And what Scurry built is the logical endpoint of everything Beach had started 6 months earlier. He took the periscope rifle concept and pushed it one step further. He built a rifle that fired itself. The mechanism was simple: 2 tins, one above the other. The upper tin was filled with water, and small holes in its bottom allowed water to drip slowly into the lower tin. When enough water had collected in the lower tin, its weight would tip a lever. The lever was connected by wire to the rifle's trigger. The rifle fired. Set it up, walk away. Along the length of the Gallipoli trenches, in the final hours before the evacuation, soldiers set up dozens of these devices. They also ran strings through candles. When the candle burned down far enough, it would cut the string and release a trigger. The last night of the evacuation, the Allied trenches were still firing rifles, shots echoing across the 50 meters of no man's land. The Turks, watching from their positions, had no reason to suspect that the men they were watching were already gone. The evacuation was completed without a single combat casualty. In the entire 8-month campaign, with nearly 60,000 Australian troops involved and a casualty rate of almost 50%, the cleanest operation was the retreat, and it was made possible by water dripping into a tin. The periscope rifle, invented to let a soldier shoot without showing his head, had become a device that shot without a soldier at all. If you're finding this kind of thing as fascinating as I do, there's a whole thread of stories like this one. Inventors nobody remembers. Solutions built from nothing in impossible conditions. Drop a comment below if you want more of that, because it genuinely helps me know what to make next, and it tells me this kind of history is worth digging into. So when you build a periscope with 2 mirrors and a cardboard tube, here is what you're actually replicating. The same geometry that a builder's foreman worked out in 3 days on a beach under artillery fire. 2 mirrors, 45 degrees each.
The top one sees what's above.
The bottom one shows it to you. The physics hasn't changed, the materials have. The stakes are different. The things to get right. The mirrors need to be exactly parallel to each other and exactly 45 degrees to the tube. Any deviation, and the image tilts or distorts. This is what killed the accuracy of Beech's early rifle versions. He could see through them, but the sight picture was never quite square. On a standard observation periscope, a small angle error matters less, but on anything you're trying to aim, it matters a lot. The other thing to get right is the distance between the mirrors. A longer tube gives you a higher view over an obstacle. A shorter tube is more compact and easier to handle. Beech's observation periscopes were sized to look over a sandbag parapet from a seated position, roughly 60 to 70 centimeters. For a basic build, that's a good starting dimension.
And if your mirrors fog,
If you're building this in cold conditions or near humidity, you now know exactly why that happens, and that the solution Leitz came up with in 1915 was to seal the optical chamber. The man who invented all of this was paid $4,000 worth of recognition for an invention that a field marshal called critical to the war. He died in 1929, 10 years after the war ended, and his name appears in almost none of the popular history of the conflict he helped shape. His name was William Beech. He was a builder's foreman, and he figured out, in 3 days, with scrap wood and 2 mirrors, something that the entire military establishment of the British Empire hadn't. That was worth knowing before you start your build. There's another inventor from this era whose name you've never heard and whose story is even stranger. It's in the next video.